Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to do a walkthrough of the first couple of pages in the 1,960 pages of the discovery document. We're going to follow the narrative of Officer Scott Coonrod, the first police officer on the scene. And although many people have seen the footage and you really do want to look at the footage, I will put a link to the video from his body cam so that you can look at that as well. But something that not everybody has seen or read is the account the officer gave of that visit to the crime scene. So obviously after he went to 2825 Saratoga Trail, he wrote a narrative of it. And so we're going to be examining that narrative prior to doing our deep dive into the actual evidence. So as a result of the popularity of the evidence video, I'm going to be analyzing specific areas of evidence for you guys, and hopefully answering some questions, especially to the folks that are sort of new to the Watts case, those who've just watched the Netflix documentary. I see on Twitter there are about 50, 60 tweets an hour on the hashtag American Murder or American Murder, the Family Next Door. So it's obviously still sort of catching on in the public imagination. So this is really for you guys who are quite new to the case. It's giving you a quite a quick appraisal of what has taken quite a long time to figure out in terms of studying these videos, studying the discovery documents, and also what's not in them, what we don't know, what's missing, where there's uncertainty, and coming up with a scenario. Because as I've said before, we don't know for certain what time the three murders happened. We don't know exactly where they happened, and there's even a certain amount of uncertainty regarding how they happened. And so as we go through the evidence, that mosaic is likely to become a lot clearer. So before we go into the discovery, and I'm going to do what I did in the previous video, I'm going to go through it, showing you the document, showing you the actual statement made by Coonrod, so that you can see that it's authentic. It's important that we know what the source is. But before we get to that, just a big thank you to the new subscribers. It's good to be at the 16,000 mark. I am fairly new onto YouTube. I think I've barely been on YouTube a year. So anyway, welcome to all the new subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do like, share, leave a comment. If you do share, use the hashtag TCRS. The hashtag is the thing that looks like two horizontal bars and two vertical bars through each other. And then, so you type that in, and then you type TCRS. And you can click on share under the YouTube video, and you can share on one of the icons there, whether it's LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. And you might just make a comment saying this is a good analysis or something like that. That helps market my work, and so if you can help out with that, that'll be great. Okay, and so let's get started with this episode. So we open the discovery documents, and you can see over there that it is 1,960 pages. So it's quite a lot, but if you compare it to some other cases, it's not really that much. Some cases have got 20,000 pages. So it's a lot to go through, but it's not the most we've ever seen. So interestingly, the very first page of the discovery documents is authored by Scott Coonrod, and it is dealing with the events of the 13th of August. The case number is over there, 2825 Saratoga Trail, and what is sort of interesting, we'll get to these charges in a moment, is that it starts on discovery page 46. So even though we've got 1,960 pages, we can clearly see that already 45 pages are missing. And so one does wonder what is in those 45 pages. So obviously the discovery was made public, and links were made available, and I actually put them up, but those have since been taken down. And so only those in the public who were actively following this case kind of got access to the original material. I must say, when I originally got the first discovery document, certain things were illegible, such as the GPS data. And this particular document, in this particular document, that data is legible. But we'll get to that in due course. So if we go to the charges, we see murder in the first degree and tampering with a deceased human body. Now, what's not necessarily clear, and I could be wrong when I say this, but it's not 3 charges of murder in the first degree, it's just 1. And then it's also tampering with a deceased human body. Now, I'm not sure if they need to say this in that sort of detail at this point, because they're just trying to outline the offence. Because we know that it was actually 3 murders and tampering with 3 bodies ultimately. But maybe it's just to look at the class of the felony that's kind of involved. Then it refers to the victims, Shanann Watts. Notice how Shanann's name is spelled. It's without an apostrophe. And then it shows the other victims, Celeste Watts, Bella Watts, and then we go to our witnesses. The very first witness mentioned is Nicole Atkinson, Nicholas Atkinson, her son, Nathaniel Trinastich, the neighbor, Taylor Welch, and that brings us to the narrative. And the narrative starts on discovery page 50. And this is what we're going to go through now, is the narrative. In other words, after Scott Coonrod arrived back at the station, this is what he wrote down, what he remembered from his visit to the crime scene. Obviously, the moment he entered it, he didn't know it was a crime scene. No crime scene tape was ever put around the Watts house. And in the beginning, they weren't quite sure. But what we do know is that Officer Coonrod was concerned enough, and to his credit, that he summoned Detective Baumhover and also other backup. He also summoned Officer James, and we can maybe deal with their narratives as well. But I want to, before we go into the deep dive into the evidence, I want to go into what the broad sort of on the surface superficial observations were from this first officer. So let's start with a narrative. On August 13th at approximately 1340, Coonrod was dispatched to 2825 Saratoga Trail on a reported check well-being. And so it was just a simple thing of, well, I'm a little bit concerned about my friend, she's not answering her phone. And so it was a simple check well-being call that led to him being dispatched. And that came from Nicole Atkinson. She was calling about Shanann, and Nicole stated that she dropped Shanann off at around 01:48 hours in the morning, and that is exactly the time that happened. And she said Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant and not feeling well. Now notice that Shanann's status is kind of highlighted via Nicole Atkinson right in the beginning, that she's pregnant. So the main thing that is of concern to Nicole Atkinson is, my friend's pregnant and I haven't heard from her. I can't get hold of her, right? And now bear in mind the time that she called was quite late, 20 to 2, and Shanann was supposed to be at the doctor at about 9:15 that morning. And so from about 10, 11 o'clock, Nicole was at the residence herself, running around and not being able to find anything, and basically alerting Chris Watts that she was there. And so she was there for quite a long time before she called the police, at around about 3 to 4 hours, which is quite a long time. And then this is the result. The officer arrives, finds out that she was pregnant. The other thing that is important is Shanann was telling Nicole that she wasn't feeling well. She was feeling sick on the way to Arizona, and then she was more emotionally upset while they were in North Carolina, Arizona. She was also sick the day Chris Watts arrived in North Carolina. Anyway, let us stick to the narrative. Nicole had dropped her off after her business flight from Arizona. There's no mention here what that business was, but it was a multi-level marketing function. And Shanann was not answering phone calls or texts and had missed her doctor's appointment. What is, I think, missing from this here is the time of the doctor's appointment. Would have been good to just establish that here. Nicole and her son Nicholas went to the Watts residence and observed Shanann's car, the Lexus, in the garage. Now, this is an early point of confusion for a lot of people. People say, well, how the hell could they see into the garage if they couldn't get into the house? And as we will see, I don't know if I mentioned it in the episode yesterday, but there are small square windows at the top of the along the top of the wooden garage where you can actually look inside. And so what Nicole did was she actually parked her car closer to the garage. So whatever position it was on the driveway, she actually maneuvered it even closer to the garage so that her son could stand on the car and look inside. And when he looked inside, he saw her car was there. When he looked inside, he saw the child seats were inside the car as well. Now, if Nicholas hadn't gone along, probably what would have happened, if Nicholas wasn't available, probably what would have happened was Nicole may have assumed that Shanann's car wasn't there. She wouldn't have been able to confirm it, and she would have sort of gone on with her day for a while. But the fact that her son could establish so early on that the car's there and the car seats are there, well, where the hell could Shanann be? If her car's there, why isn't she there? And then the fact that she hadn't gone to a doctor was also significant, especially since she hadn't been feeling well. Nicole attempted to enter the front door, but it had a latch which prevents you from opening it more than 3 inches. Now, this is quite an interesting point. You might think that it's completely normal that a friend would try to enter the front door, but actually it isn't. I mean, if you're not home, would you expect your friends to enter your front door? Now, there might be some friends that you might expect that from, but there's more to this than that. Nicole and her son had babysat or dog sat Dieter in the week that Chris Watts was away, and so that is why she had access to the front door. And as we'll get to it in a second, just over there, Nicole entered the password for the front door and it opened. So just before we move on, let's just deal with something else. Something that has come up quite a few times is this sort of issue of, if Chris Watts spent every night at Nicole Kessinger during especially the month of July, what happened to the dog? If he was never home, what happened to the dog? I think there are two possibilities. I think the one is that he took the dog with to Nicole Kessinger because she had a dog as well. I must say, I do that with my dog when I go and see friends of mine. For an extended time, I take my dog with. And a big part of the reason is they've also got dogs. And so that's a possibility. Another possibility is that he would cage Dieter, in the basement. And if that's the case, poor Dieter spent most of July caged up. I just find that very unlikely because I know how dogs can cry and whine and so on, and a dachshund is particularly likely to do that. So, and you didn't hear the neighbors talking about that. We do hear in the Netflix documentary, we hear the dog barking, but it's faint. So that does suggest that if he did lock the dog up in the basement, you might not hear it. It does make you wonder if Dieter was treated that way and Watts didn't mind, whether that helped him deal with the other cruel things that were in store for the family, kind of thing. But it might suggest kind of a very two-faced character, a guy who's a nice guy to his girlfriend, to his mistress, and a not a very nice pet owner, not a very caring dog owner. Anyway, so if we just go back to that, if the latch wasn't in place, and Nicole did say the latch usually wasn't in place, she would have expected access to the front door. Nicole would have entered the crime scene, and it could have made a beautiful defense case for contamination. But the other issue that comes up is, could Nicole and Nicholas have found something in the house lying in plain sight that Chris Watts hadn't meant to leave lying around? And that's another issue. One does wonder when Chris Watts went into the house and he was inside for 1 minute what did he do? What did he pick up? What did he move? It would be interesting to know that. So while they're in front of the house, Nicole called Shanann's husband. She'd also called him before the officer arrived and requested that he come and check on Shanann. Nicole said that Shanann was diabetic but was not known to have seizures or to ever black out. That's not strictly speaking correct. I think the way I understand it, she had diabetes associated with being pregnant. In other words, brought on by the pregnancy. I don't think Shanann was like ordinarily a diabetic, but it certainly was a factor. In other words, she would sometimes have low blood sugar and dizzy spells when she was pregnant. It's not that uncommon. So now we get to the arrival of the officer on the scene. So he says, upon arrival, I checked the front door, and we see him approaching the front door. Nicole had entered the password and it opened. In other words, so Nicole has got access to the front door. This is the part that's interesting, is Chris Watts knows that. Chris Watts knows that Nicole almost like has a front door key and that she can enter. And maybe that is why the door was latched, because he didn't want her to enter. He specifically didn't want her inside the house. And so ironically, yes, she is summoning him to the house and having called the police. The door had a safety latch. It's something like you see in some hotel rooms, which prevented it from opening more than a few inches. I announced police department. Well, I guess that means he called the police department and heard no noises from Shanann or her children, Celeste and Bella. Now, what is strange for me a little bit in this is he did hear a noise. You could hear the dog barking. And you might think that that's not important, but it is important, because why is the dog not sort of, if you had to come to my house, before you saw me, you would hear the dog. And that would mean that I'm home. And if I'm not home, you would probably also hear the dog, if I'd left the dog at home. but it's kind of that is something that is going to tell you, well, someone is home, the dog. But where the dog is also going to give you an indication. So, if you come to my home and the dog is in the garden, probably means I'm here. If the dog's in the kitchen, in kind of a cordoned off space, it means I may have gone grocery shopping, right? And that would also maybe give you an indication where Shanann was based on how the dog was sort of, sequestrated. And also the tone of the dog's barking would give you an idea how long the dog had possibly been left alone. So there's quite a lot you could sort of tell from that. But of course, Dieter doesn't come to the front door, but it's just strange that he doesn't mention this, that they don't mention the dog barking. He goes on to say, I did not see anything through the windows that was out of the ordinary. Well, that's quite an important point, and that is something that I think Chris Watts would have thought about, is if someone does look through the windows, they need to not be able to see anything. And one thing that is quite interesting is from the front door, you can't, in other words, from those windows near the front door, you can't actually see anything in the lounge. In other words, the seats where the children are, or the children were, the little children's couches, they aren't actually visible from the front door, although part of the lounge is. He goes on to say, I checked all windows and the rear slider door. All were locked, and the sliding glass door had a bar lock on it. Now, what's very significant here is, here he is established before Chris Watts arrives at the residence, and this is a really important point, the fact that before Chris Watts arrived, the officer arrived, and although he couldn't get access to the interior of the home, he could verify that it was completely locked. And what he would then, and this became a very strong point legally, it came up, I think it comes up in the warrantless arrest affidavit, which we'll get to as well. It shows that the house was locked from the inside, right? So to put that door latch on, the front door, means it had to be locked from the inside. Now, to be locked from the inside means who would do that? Well, obviously Chris Watts, when he left through the garage. And what that also shows, and that's something the FBI and CBI knew when they were interrogating Chris Watts, was that Shanann didn't leave the house willingly. So you see her entering the house through the Ring doorbell camera, and that's also footage you're going to be dealing with. But we don't see her leaving. And so how can she not leave and all of the exits are locked from the inside? So if just one, how can I put it, if one entry or exit had been locked from the outside in an obvious way, that would have suggested that Shanann could have left on her own, and in particular, the front door. So I think in a way Watts shot himself in the foot by latching that front door, because he could have used that as a reason for that Shanann had left. The fact that the door was latched clearly showed that she hadn't left. Also, the fact that her shoes were left at the front door showed that she probably hadn't left. He says he also checked the sliding glass door, and that had a lock bar on it. Nicole kept saying Christopher was not coming. So this is something that I think would have gotten the interest of the officer, where he would have said, wow, it is strange that this guy's pregnant wife could be in distress, and Christopher's just not coming back. Why is the friend more concerned than he is? So Nicole, while Christopher was on his way, but in his absence, told the officer she'd called Watts several times, and this is the other thing, he kept giving her different arrival times. Now, that's also going to be cause for concern. Why didn't he just say, I'm on my way, I'll be there at that time? And he had to know exactly how long it was going to take him. And so what it seems as if Watts was doing was he was delaying this confrontation, he was postponing it. He was trying to buy himself some time. And Nicole just wasn't going to be put off. Nicole did actually leave the home to go to the doctor. She used the same clinic, and she was I think a call center nurse as well. I think Nicole is a qualified nurse. I'm not 100% sure, but she was working part-time as a kind of a call center nurse. I should know this better than I do, but anyway, so she was aware of those laws, those privacy laws, and nevertheless she got the receptionist to tell her, well, actually Shanann didn't pitch up for her appointment. And that gave her the confidence and that little piece of information gave her the confidence and the certainty to contact the authorities. And so because Nicole had called several times, it gave the officer reasonable sort of cause to contact Christopher himself. And so what he did was he called him and asked for the garage door code. Now what is quite interesting here is even when Christopher arrived, the officer wouldn't enter the entrance because he felt, well, I need the consent of the owner, right? And so one wonders what was going to happen if Watts did provide the garage door code. What was going to happen? The answer is probably that he would need to consent to Nicole Atkinson entering the scene. And I think he didn't want her to enter the scene, otherwise he would have, he couldn't do that because the garage door code didn't work from the outside. I'm just saying if he could have, in other words, if the garage door did work, would he have given it to her? And I think the answer is no. I think he wanted to be there when they entered the crime scene. I think there were one or two things he probably wanted to just make absolutely sure about. And I think one of the big ones was planting Shanann's phone so that it's, I mean, can you imagine if the phone was actually found in her car? You'd sort of wonder, now why was the phone in her car? And, you know, did she get into her car? Kind of thing. Also, it would be even worse if her purse was, say, in his closet or something like that. And then another thing that I think is really important to establish here is that if you go through the phone data review, as I did exhaustively in a series that's on YouTube and then it finishes on Patreon, we saw how Shanann got more and more upset because of a problem with the Vivint security and in particular this garage sensor. As far as I'm aware, Shanann's parents were aware of it not working when they lived there in 2015. In any event, it still didn't work. So despite all of his calls, we know that he called Vivint a few times in July, including right before he left, that it still wasn't fixed, this Vivint sensor from the garage. And so I think that's a very important aspect, the dodgy sensor in the garage, and I'll provide a picture to it at the end of this video. It's very important that didn't work because it allowed him to go to Kessinger every night, and Shanann didn't know, because he was entering through the garage door. She didn't know that he was leaving when he was leaving and arriving back when he arrived back. So it was important for him that it didn't work. And because he used that so effectively to have the affair, I think it entered his premeditation that he could use that to hide the removal of the bodies. So in other words, he fooled Shanann about times that he'd left and what he was doing. And so he could use that little trick, that tactic in terms of the dodgy garage sensor to conceal what he was doing on the driveway that day. Does that make sense? So Watts said it didn't work from the outside, and he was only about 5 minutes away at the time. Now, you might think that there's a policeman at Watts's house, and Watts would now race to get there as fast as he could. And instead, he actually went kind of a long way round, and he went to a road kind of around the corner called Black Mesa, and he did two things there. He would indicate to his realtor that that was the kind of house that he was living in, so it's a similar model home. So in other words, I think she was trying to evaluate how much his home was worth or something like that. And he also disposed of evidence there, probably some of his own clothing, probably the children's blankets, one or two or both of them, and possibly also the containers that he loaded into the truck, possibly with their bodies inside. And so we don't know exactly what he got rid of, but that has never been found. So this was something that Officer Coonrod wasn't aware of. But if you think Chris Watts is committed triple murder, and this is really important, he certainly took his time getting back to the scene. And just shows you that he's someone who does want to avoid confrontation. And then you have Chris Watts arriving, and this is something we've all seen quite a few times. And that's something I think I did mention in the episode about evidence. When Watts arrived, you kind of see him tuck something under his arm, and nothing of that is mentioned here. There's not much description from the officer about that arrival. Literally what happened was Watts arrived. He didn't actually park right in front of the driveway where you'd imagine him to park. He parked almost behind the trees on the Trinastich side. So he parked quite far, further than you'd expect. And then he also didn't just get out and go straight to the officer. He got out and then he looked for something in the back area of the work truck, of the Lariat work truck. And of course later on he said that is where he put the bodies when he went to the... So one wonders what was he doing looking at the... what was he doing opening the side to his vehicle? And of course he did the same thing when he went into the garage. Anyway, he says when Christopher arrived, we went inside through the garage to check for Shanann and the two children. That's not accurate. When Christopher arrived, it's actually he went inside through the garage to check for Shanann and the two children, right? So this is possibly a typo, possibly an error. Possibly Coonrod just forgot that that's not how they entered. But actually what it was Watts went in by himself, and then Atkinson kind of said, wow, can't we go in? And I think Nicholas also said, what's he doing inside, whatever. And then Coonrod said, well, we can't go in without his consent. And Chris Watts seemed to know that. And so they waited outside. Well, Watts certainly didn't enter the garage and then go straight to the front door. That would have taken 10 or 15 seconds. So for about 45 seconds, he was doing something that we just don't know. That's time enough to run upstairs, maybe strip the bed while he was upstairs. Maybe he cleaned something quickly off the floor. Maybe he got rid of the nitrile glove. And maybe because there were actually two, maybe got rid of both of them or just moved them away. In any event, the next thing he mentions is, so bear in mind, even here, he doesn't mention the length of time that Watts was in the house. Watts gave consent to check the entire home. So, although that's true, he didn't just consent to check the entire home. He kind of opened the door and then rushed back inside, if you remember the footage clearly. He opened the door, rushed back inside, rushed sort of towards the kitchen. Nicole and the officer then entered sort of slower than what Watts was walking. And by the time they got to the kitchen, Watts was sort of doing like a loop around them, and this time heading to the basement. And Coonrod is still trying to catch up to him because Watts is moving so quickly, and saying, is it okay if I look around? So Coonrod actually walked basically up to the kitchen and then sort of towards the entrance to the basement before he said, is it okay if I look around? And Watts said, yeah, sure. And he couldn't even sort of, there was no point right in the beginning where Watts is standing in front of the officer talking to him and saying, okay, what's going on? What's going on with your wife? What's her status? What's her health? Did you see anything? He's constantly sort of avoiding that. He's constantly moving away. And you can see how he doesn't want confrontation. And when he is talking, he sort of sways and his lip curls and he folds his arms and he does look very guilty and very nervous. So the next thing is, no one was found in the residence. Something else that he doesn't mention is that, and it's easy to say in hindsight, of course, but something else that he doesn't mention is that Watts never calls out anybody's name. He doesn't enter and say, Shanann, are you here? He doesn't call his daughters either. And what is kind of interesting is, if you think about it, when Nicole and the officer are present, where does Scott go? He goes from the kitchen to the basement. Why would he look for them in the basement? Now, we know he does let Dieter out from the basement, but why not do that right in the beginning when he sort of entered? But you don't hear him calling out when he arrives. You also don't have him just say, well, come with me, let's go inside, So anyway, Christopher did come up to me holding Shanann's wedding ring and stated he found it on the nightstand. Now, this is obviously something that struck the officer, and to his credit, he's 100% about this. So what he's kind of saying is this is a problem. This is kind of suspicious. So this is the thing that to Coonrod is setting off the alarm bells in his mind, is Watts goes up to him. So all this time Watts has kind of been running around, running away, hard to sort of how can I put it, nail down. And then there's this moment where he comes up to him. It's not strictly true. He doesn't go right up to the officer. He actually approached Nicole. And held out Shanann's wedding ring on his finger. And he didn't really say anything. He just held it out to her, almost as if to say, well, it's self-evident, isn't it? And Nicole didn't really respond. And when the officer said, well, what's that about? He said, well, he found it on the nightstand. That's something else that we'd want to know is, was it on the nightstand when Watts entered by himself? Or did he put it there when he entered by himself? Then in the next line, when Nicole asked where Shanann's phone was, Christopher went to the couch upstairs and found it between the cushions. That's also not accurate. Christopher didn't go to the couch. Christopher didn't find it between the cushions. Nicholas did. That is, in theory, kind of a boo-boo from the police that a minor found a critical piece of evidence, and that could be argued is contaminating the crime scene. In other words, a defense lawyer, although it's very cynical, could say, well, whatever's on Shanann's phone, maybe Nicholas did something when no one was looking. I don't think that's the case, but it would be a way for a defense case to raise doubt. And so it is interesting that, did the officer not know this? Did the officer not know that Watts had not retrieved the phone, but Nicholas had? It does seem like he didn't know. And what that already shows you is how easy it is to be misled by, even if you're on the scene. Then Watts did not know what the password was to Shanann's phone. Now, this is quite an interesting question. Did he really not know what it was? Or was he pretending not to know what it was? In other words, because if he pretends not to know what it was, they're not going to get access to it. Now, what is interesting is when the FBI agent Coda interviewed Watts, he knew the passwords to everything off the top of his head. He could tell you, I think, the router password, the front door password, the laptop password, the iPhone passwords. He knew all of them, and he knew all of them off the top of his head. So did he really not know the password to Shanann's phone? I think he did. I think he did know the password to it. But it is possible that he didn't. It is possible that she changed it. The fact that Nicole knew it, and I think this is also a error, because it was actually Cassandra, I think, that knew what it was. I say this under correction, but I think, as far as I remember, Nicole, Cassie, and Shanann's mother, I think they were on like a group call, and I think it was Cassie who somehow knew that that was the PIN, and then told Nicole about it, and that's how Nicole accessed it. There's also a very interesting moment where Officer Coonrod asks about the bank account. Nicole also asks him about it, and Watts says something absurd like, he's got the app on his phone, he's got the password to that, he's got the password to the app or whatever, but not the username. It just doesn't make any sense, that kind of thing. And why would he lie about not knowing the finances? Because that definitely was part of his motive. His motive was to take control of the finances, to take control of the money, the house, all that kind of thing. And so it would make sense that he would pretend not to know the state of their finances and just say, well, Shanann was in control of it. He didn't know what was going on, because that would give him plausible deniability for what actually happened. So did Watts actually know the state of the finances? Did he actually have access? I think the answer is yes. Could he use that access? No, because he'd get into trouble. So in the same way, I think he did have access to Shanann's phone, but didn't want to let on that he had access. And so that brings us to the next line here, which is quite interesting. So Officer Coonrod establishes that no calls were made that morning, which showed that something was wrong. It showed that between her arrival at just before 2 in the morning and past 2 p.m., there wasn't a single call made. And now this is reasonable cause that something could well be wrong. And as a result of that, in the very next sort of line, Coonrod says, I contacted Detective Bormova and requested he come to the residence. So as soon as he established that no calls were made, he felt, okay, well, now I need backup. There definitely is something up, and he was right. Nicole also made a very good point that Shanann would never leave without her phone. She might leave without the medication. She would never leave without her phone. She might leave without her car. She would never leave without her phone. She might leave, I'm trying to think of another example, but she was just someone who was constantly on her phone, and everybody knew that about her. The Lindstroms knew her that way. The Thayers knew her that way. the Thrivers knew her that way, Chris Watts knew her that way. And this was a big error in terms of criminal psychology, that Watts didn't hide away her phone. I think the difficulty may have been that, if you hide the phone away, you need to get to where you're hiding the phone away. And if you've also got a phone, isn't that going to show you were there as well? And that was the dilemma he was stuck with. Because there are, as far as I'm aware, Apple phones can give off a signal even when they're off in terms of their location. And so that is difficult in terms of that. In the Frazee case, the phone has a life after the death of its owner. It moves around. It even sends texts after Kelsey's disappeared. And so that's something that may have been learned from the Watts case, which also happened in Colorado. In the Suzanne Morphew case, there are Facebook, there is Facebook activity likely after Suzanne died, which is also calling into question, well, at what time did she die? So things like that muddy the time of death. But in any event, here they had confirmation that no calls were made that morning. And that would have been very unusual for Shanann. Then Christopher stated Shanann arrived home from a work trip around 0200. We know it was 0148. We also know that Chris Watts could be quite specific if he wanted to. So that's a little bit of a, maybe we're nitpicking, but it wasn't 0200, it was 0148. The True Crime Rocket Science position is that Shanann likely lost her life before 2 o'clock in the morning, so something like 0149, but very, very early on. And then he says he was asleep at the time, so he said he was sleeping at the time. Interestingly, he doesn't say where. Where was he asleep at the time? He did tell Shanann that he was on the couch, right? His last text to Shanann was passed out on the couch. So he's kind of locating himself that he's not in bed, that he's sleeping on the couch. You can go to bed. You can go, I'm sleeping on the couch. And this is not speculation. They had been sleeping separately for about 6 weeks. Even when they were together in North Carolina and Myrtle Beach, and even when they came back from that trip, they still continued to sleep apart. And so Shanann would have anticipated that they would sleep apart when they got back. A lot of people don't believe that, but I think those people aren't familiar with the phone data review and the personalities of these people. Then he says he woke up around 0500. Now this is really interesting. It's interesting because in his version to Coda, he would change it. Now his version to Coda was basically 1 day later. In other words, Tuesday night, he told Coda he woke up at 4 in the morning. So why did he change that? Why did he change that he woke up at 5 to 4? That's quite a big difference. Something else that's not mentioned here so far is that this was unanticipated. Shanann arriving home late, at 0200. She was supposed to arrive home between about 11 o'clock and midnight. And something I established in the phone data review is Chris Watts and Shanann had arrived home together from the airport late at night previously, so he knew what would typically happen when they arrived home. What would she do? What would be the first thing they would do? What would be the first thing she would do when they arrived home from the airport? What would happen? And so he knew that. So in a premeditated scenario, he knew what to expect. So he says he woke up at around 5 to get ready for work, and they began talking. Now, in his second confession, he said that they actually had sex, and and then he killed Shanann in a kind of a spontaneous, that he just snapped. Anyway, he says he got ready for work and they began talking about them separating. He doesn't mention that Shanann said to him something like, so what was that alert you got for, you know, the meal that you had at the Lazy Dog restaurant? She received a credit card alert on her phone on Saturday night, and she was alerted to such an extent that she Googled the restaurant, she Googled the menu, she asked him about it, and she told him to keep the receipt. So he knew that was going to come up, and he was cheating on her. He was with his mistress at that restaurant, and the bill was higher than it should have been because he was treating his mistress to dinner. And he'd never used the credit card before. He'd used Anadarko gift cards. And so this was a really dumb mistake, unless he wanted her to tell her friends, you know, I'm worried. I just don't think that makes any sense, that he would want to alert. Maybe he thought she wouldn't believe that he was having an affair, but if she said something like that, it would make sense why she would leave the next morning. I don't know how I thought about that. Interestingly, he says it was a civil conversation and they were not arguing. I think that's really interesting point. It's interesting that he talks about it being civil. I don't think it would have been civil if they had spoken. I don't think it was very civil when they were in North Carolina. I think we're going to get to it in due course, but he does talk about the neighbors said he heard Christopher numerous times in the past yelling loudly at Shanann. He doesn't really mention Shanann yelling, but it is something worth sort of pointing out. So, look, we're almost an hour into this and there's another page to go. My dog wants to go for a walk, so I think I'm going to have to do this in two parts. But let's just finish up with page 50. So he said it was a civil conversation and they were not arguing. They'd been arguing really for on and off for about 6 weeks, and particularly in the week that they were in North Carolina together. They'd been arguing constantly. And so to say, and there's evidence of this on Shanann's phone in particular, he wanted to cancel the gender reveal, he wanted her to have an abortion, or he wasn't happy with a baby, and he wanted a divorce, and all these things were very upsetting to her. Why? Well, she was pregnant, they were in serious debt, and she wanted to stay married, and she was concerned that he was having an affair. And even though she was concerned, she was sort of almost like more concerned, I need to keep this marriage together. Maybe I can control him enough that he will stay married to me. Maybe if I just... anyway, so I think there would have been a big argument if she'd come back from that trip and he'd said, you know, I do still want... She left on that trip assuming that their marriage was kind of going better, and that there was still hope. And if she'd arrived back and he'd said to her, no, I kind of misled you a little bit, I just wanted to buy a little bit of time, I need a bit of a break, I do still want a divorce, she would have immediately gone back to, are you having an affair? Because she had thought of it, she had mentioned it, and of course he was. And she'd mentioned a couple of times, the only thing that I can think of is either his parents, he's upset about that, or that there may be another girl. Because another thing was that he wasn't having sex with her. And she was trying to figure out why would he not want to have sex with her. Well, the only thing she could think of is perhaps there's another girl. And of course there was. And of course he was actively sleeping with her. And so if that had come up, it wouldn't have been a civil conversation. In other words, if it came up that he was having an affair and he admitted to having an affair, it would not have been a civil conversation. It would have been not Nutgate. Hey, Sorry, that's my dog. He's getting very restless. It would not have been a civil conversation. It would have been a fair gate. It would have been a massive explosion. And they would have argued. They would have been screaming. And it wouldn't have mattered that the children were sleeping. It would have mattered that, what are we going to do about our marriage? What are we going to do about this? You betrayed me, and all that kind of thing. It would have been horrible. And that was precisely what Chris Watts wanted to prevent, was this horrible confrontation, this conflagration, this threatening and swearing and sputtering and crying and all that. He wanted to avoid that. He wanted to avoid a meltdown. He wanted to control it so that it was like a divorce, except that it was a divorce with no obligations, no consequences. And that's what Christopher Watts expected. Also that he could commit murder with no consequences. And of course there were. He said they were emotional, though. Christopher stated that they'd been talking about separating for a few weeks. That's not really accurate. It's really about 2 weeks. But one could read a bit more into that. The fact that Shanann had gotten pregnant the third time does look like they'd both felt a third child might fix the doldrums in their marriage. Their marriage was not quite as fresh and vigorous, and the spark was missing in their marriage, and I think they both felt that to some extent. And that is why Shanann, I think, consented to the pregnancy. It was actually Watts's idea initially, and I think Shanann went along with it to save her marriage. And then Christopher stated at about 05:27 hours he backed his truck up to the garage. I'm not sure if that's accurate. I think it's 05:18, but I need to check on that. I'll establish that in the description, the exact time he backed his truck up, but I seem to remember it being a little bit earlier than that. To load up tools, and we know that we'll get to that in the next episode. The neighbor said he'd never done that before. Nicole Atkinson said the same thing, that was something that was very unusual. And then he left. So Watts did admit he was loading something up, and guess what he was loading up? Bodies. Now a lot of people seem to think that he would just load the bodies up and carry them onto the driveway, in broad daylight. Well, that is why he backed the truck right up to and with the edge of it into the garage, so that he didn't need to carry bodies onto the driveway. And what I think he may have done is he may have loaded them into the back, and then when he pulled the car forward, you can't see, in terms of the camera, you can't see through the foliage, and he may then have transferred them from the back to the back seat. I do think that the bodies were in containers, especially the bodies of the children, so you wouldn't have thought much of it if you saw him. You wouldn't have thought much of it, someone passing by. I don't think you would have thought much of it, because you would see containers, and so I believe that they did use containers. It is possible that Shanann's body was dragged along the driveway, but it is quite hard to imagine that he would literally be not in broad daylight because it was night, but be doing something like that, and neighbor could just look through through a window and see him. So one wonders how he did that in a way that wouldn't look like that. And so obviously he was trying to conflate the loading of equipment with the loading of bodies. And we do know he walked around a little bit with a red gas can, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that in due course. And making quite a few trips this way and that way. But there is certainly a bit of uncertainty as to how exactly that happened. to put it mildly. And then Christopher said that he had tools stolen in the past. And then Christopher said that Shanann told him she was going to a friend's house with their 2 children. He didn't ask which friend's house she was going to. That didn't make any sense, because that day was going to be Bella's first day at school. And what he said to the media the next day was Bella was going to start school the next week, which wasn't true. She'd actually texted him on the Sunday, will you come with me to drop Bella off at kindergarten? And he said he definitely would. So that's clearly a lie. Someone asked, why did Shanann go to North Carolina for 5 weeks in the first place? I believe it was she knew that she was pregnant. She knew that they needed to make more money, especially with another child on the way. And she went there for kind of 2 reasons. One was to do some more Thrive events, in other words, to recruit more people, right? Kind of in a new market, a market that she knew well because she'd grown up there. So that was the one side of it. And I think the other was she was relying on both grandparents to babysit the children, and that way she could save, I think it's about $500, is it a week? So around about $2,500 while they were away. I say that under correction. I'm not exactly sure that that is the amount of time. My dog's licking my foot, so I'm a little bit not as sure as I'd like to be, but I think that's around about correct. So in other words, she was saving $2,500 by taking the kids out of school for 5 or 6 weeks, for 5 weeks anyway. Shanann's mother called during this time. So what's it told? Let's just go to this section. Christopher stated he did not ask Shanann which house. Okay, Christopher stated he went to a job site, oil well past Hudson, Colorado, to check on it. That's a very important part. It's very important when he got the go-ahead to do that and all the circumstances surrounding that. I will also deal with that in a separate episode, but what's important to highlight here is he didn't go past Hudson. He went past Roggan. Hudson is before Roggan. So by telling him Hudson, he was being a little bit unclear about actually where he was. Roggan is much closer to where he was than Hudson. So, and it wasn't Roggan either. It was Survey 319, which is a very difficult place to locate if you're a civilian, if you don't ordinarily have access. And the other thing that's interesting is Watts didn't normally go out to a well site first thing in the morning, and his colleagues would later attest to that. So he was trying to make it look like what he was doing was a normal work day, but it actually wasn't. It wasn't normal. So quite a few things were normal. It wasn't normal for him to go to Roggan first thing in the morning. It wasn't usual that he would load tools or back his truck up on the driveway. And then he said he was alone at Survey 319 for a few hours. When the FBI asked him, exactly where was he would give 3 or 4 different well sites, and that would have been a nightmare to check. It would have been a logistical nightmare to flush all of those tanks out in those sites that he checked on. And of course, you wouldn't find Shanann's body easily if you didn't know which specific site it was at. So if Chris Watts hadn't told them where the bodies were, I don't know if they would have found them very quickly or very easily. So Watts said he was an operator at Anadarko. Of course, that is where his mistress worked as well. And then Shanann's mother called during this time. She was actually on the call with Nicole even before the officer arrived. And he says she was adamant that Christopher had done something and that I needed to check the GPS on his truck. Christopher's work truck has GPS on it. So Shanann's mother seemed to know that something was happening immediately. And one's got to kind of ask why. Like why would she have known? Why would she think that? Well, one answer is that she saw what he was like in North Carolina, that he was cold and standoffish, and they didn't seem to really be getting along. So even though she was adamant, they allowed that day to pass. And obviously she was right. And by the next morning, she was calling the police again, and that was when Baumhover contacted the media. And this is where Baumhover enters the scene. So at the bottom of page 50, Coonrod says, Detective Baumhover and I checked the residence thoroughly. Shanann's purse, wallet, phone, credit cards were all at the residence. We observed nothing suspicious inside the residence. So on the one hand, even a seasoned detective and police checking the residence, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. So what's left the residence pretty kind of clean, and that it's not going to raise any suspicions, right? The only thing that really was suspicious to an outsider, I guess, was why has the bed been stripped? And because the bed is stripped, a lot of ordinary people, even some of the most obsessive people covering this case, following this case, have felt, well, the fact that the bed was stripped is evidence enough for me that that's where Shanann was murdered. But what they're not thinking about, beyond the dynamics of these people, beyond the personalities of these people, beyond the context, they're simply seeing, well, the bed was stripped, it's because Chris is covering up, that's where the murder happened. What they're not thinking about is, well, what was taken from that bed? And the answer is the fitted sheet. And if the bed wasn't stripped, so in other words, if he'd left the bed the way it was, you would have seen that something's missing from the bed. So if you kind of, let's say, Watson just, when he committed the crime, he just removed the fitted sheet to carry Shanann's body in, and he'd left everything else the same. Someone who knew the Watts home, like Nicole Atkinson, would have said, well, there's something missing here, the fitted sheet's missing. And he wanted that to be hidden away, the missing part of that. The other thing that would have been missing would be one or more of the pillow covers, because, for example, one pillow cover was used to pick up excrement. So if you found the bed and you see, well, wow, there's one pillow cover missing and the fitted sheet, what's that going to point to? Well, it happened to be the sheet was still fluttering outside at the well site. And so that the fact that was missing was something that needed to be covered up. And that is why Watts did what he did, not because Shanann slept in that bed. And it became a necessary and a convenient cover to bring up the bed. Bear in mind, his first version was that Shanann had murdered Cece on Cece's bed, and Watts had murdered Shanann on Cece's bed. That was his first version. That was later adapted to, in his second confession, to he murdered Shanann in their bedroom after that they'd had sex. And that was based on him thinking a bit more about the circumstances and adapting his version and improving his version to what you'd expect to hear. It's also the same reason he changed the 5 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the morning. He needed more time for them to have an argument or a conversation or whatever. And so I'm not going to take it further than that. We're at 70 minutes. I'll deal with the next page in a part 2 to this episode. And after that, we will then dive deeper into the evidence. We'll look at the evidence in meticulous detail and in depth. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If you share, please use the hashtag TCRS. And I'll see you guys next time.
joint account?
It's a joint account, but like she controls all of it. Like she doesn't let me do the finances because I was pretty horrible back in the day, so she just kind of handles all that and she does it. And I have the apps on my phone, but I don't have her login to get into it.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's.
Can you log into your account though?
I can. No, I don't have we don't have a laptop, but she has the one downstairs still. But her login is different. Her login, I don't know her login. Like I know the password, but I don't know her login for the user or anything. It's always the same password, 4281915 capital SW. But it's just a matter of getting the login.
Usually the first of the show activity if she...
Right, if she's getting gas or...
Yeah, somewhere.